This video is part one in a two-part series on slavery under the law of Moses. I've included much of the audio from a speech provided by Paul Copan at the Wyndale University College in March of 2011. For those of you who are not aware, Paul Copan has written a book entitled, Is God a Moral Monster? He lays out much of his argument from the book regarding slavery and genocide in this speech. As a resource for rebuttal, I am using parts of a book by Tom Stark. If you are not aware, Tom Stark has written a book entitled, Is God a Moral Compromiser? This book is free of charge and published online. I have included a link in the description, and I encourage all of you to read the book. It's over 300 pages, but well worth the read. I've edited the audio from Copan's speech to remove what I believe to be the extraneous parts. I do not believe, however, that this editing affects Copan's argument. I apologize for the length of this video, but I wanted to ensure to include Copan's full argument. I believe this is the best way to critique it. Additionally, I have included many of the passages Copan quotes so you can read along during the speech.
In the Old Testament, the institution that we see in the law of Moses is Hebrew debt servitude. Many translations render this slavery, but this is, as I said, this could be compared to an apprentice-like position to pay off debts. So slavery is not a good term for this. Servitude is not something that is a matter of ownership. It is a matter of contract. It is when somebody hires himself out. And even if you talk about buying and selling or whatever, if someone sells himself into servitude, you might read in Leviticus 25. Well, this is the kind of selling of oneself who, like a player who might sell himself to a team. Teams have owners and so forth. And we don't think that a person is property just because we use the language of team owners or buying a player or something like that. And so as we look at the Old Testament, we see that slavery, or better servitude, is entered into voluntarily. Someone sells himself. Now, what about passages where it talks about if a man sells his daughter? Now, what kind of a decent father would do that to his daughter? Well, the sort of arrangement that you have is genuine. There's genuine poverty that sets the context for this. There is destitution. A person has no alternative. What can he do? Doesn't have any land, doesn't have a house, doesn't have any money, his crops have failed. Well, he parcels out his family to relatives, to friends nearby, and they provide food, clothing, shelter, and a means to pay off that debt. And they have the security of that home in the meantime. The cap on the debt was 7 years. That you could not go beyond that unless the servant entered into an agreement to make it permanent. And you have the ceremony at the end of Exodus 21 that talks about the ear, the gouging of the ear, the piercing of the ear, where an awl is taken to the ear and put against the door in front of the judges, and it is made an official arrangement that it becomes permanent.
I'd like to start by addressing three items. First, Copan tries to define slavery under the law of Moses as indentured servitude with a maximum term of only 6 years. Now, this definitely seems to apply to male Hebrew slaves. However, as we will see later, it is not the case for non-Hebrew slaves. Additionally, Copan tries to show that Israel's release laws were unique in the ancient Near East. However, the Code of Hammurabi actually had better release laws, as its slaves could only serve a maximum of 3 years. Next, Copan tries to compare the institution of slavery under the law of Moses to modern-day athletes. However, this is just plain stupid. Not only do most professional athletes make a substantial amount of money, but they also have privileges that slaves would not have, including being able to go home after playing for the day, not having to leave their wives and children when they are traded, and they obviously cannot be physically abused.
But the important thing to remember here is that servanthood was not imposed by an outsider, as it was in the antebellum South. Indentured servants could be, as Leviticus 25 said, hired from year to year and weren't to be ruled over ruthlessly. And to impose lifelong servitude on, say, a fellow Israelite was not permitted. The legal status of the servant in Israel was unique in the rest of the ancient Near East. It is a dramatic improvement over ancient Near Eastern law codes. One scholar says Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only servanthood. And so Israel, even though it had this, it had this safety net of protecting the poor, so that they could work themselves out of debt and have a place to live, to thrive, to be fed and clothed for a period of 7 years, so they could get themselves out of debt. This was not intended to be a hammock where people could just relax, or an institution that was to be perpetuated, but it was a temporary safeguard to prevent permanent destitution and servitude. Servants had dignity in Israel. Israel's laws were concerned about regulating servitude rather than institutionalizing it. Israel prohibited forced slavery, as we'll see shortly. The Old Testament legislation sought to prevent voluntary debt servitude in a number of different ways. There were a number of ways in which Israel's laws sought to make it easier for the poor to get out of debt, to sustain themselves and so forth. So you have things like gleaning laws, where the poor could go to the edges of the fields that hadn't been completely mowed down, and they could gather grain for themselves, or pick fruit from trees that were to be left there, that they were not to be picked clean by their owners. Israelites were not to be charged interest. They were to be, and debts were to be automatically canceled every 7 years. And in the year of Jubilee, the 50th year, the land would revert to its owner, so that land could not be accumulated over the generations, but it was to be given back to the original owners every 50 years. So as one person puts it, for the first time in the ancient Near East, as we read the law of Moses, we see how servants are to be treated at the very beginning of the Mosaic Law Code in Exodus 21. So you have, right after the giving of the Ten Commandments, you have how servants are to be treated, rather than being relegated to the very back of the law codes, as was the case in other ancient Near Eastern codes. You have the Mosaic Law Code that talks about the treatment and the dignity of the servant. As one scholar puts it, we have in the Bible for the first appeals in world literature to treat slaves as human beings for their own sake, and not just in the interests of their masters. One of the things that I like to point out is that if there were 3 fundamental regulations kept in the law of or preserved in the law of Moses for us, that were carried out in the West by, say, colonial powers, slavery would not have been an issue. A lot of people said, well, you've got people who are reading the same Bible, they're appealing to the same texts, but yet some say slavery is wrong, others say slavery is right. What I would say is, if you read the biblical text more closely, the practice of slavery evaporates. And let me explain why. In the first place, there were anti-harm laws. That if you brought harm to your servant, if you gouged out his eye, knocked out his tooth, that servant was to be let go, and the debt was to be canceled. We see this in Exodus 21. Injured servants were to be released. Now, if this were to be practiced in the antebellum South, that the kind of treatment that is often spoken about in Uncle Tom's Cabin and in the literature elsewhere would not have taken place at all. We would not be reading about that. We know about the horrendous treatment of those, and you sometimes see pictures of people who are just whipped without mercy, and you see the scars on the back to prove it. So the first law that was not typically kept in the pre-Civil War South was that of the anti-harm law. Also, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy, we read about anti-kidnapping laws. Now, how did slavery get started in the West? Well, people were kidnapped. They were taken against their will from their country and brought to a new place to which they did not want to come. But yet we see in the law of Moses a condemnation of kidnapping that was punishable by death. Kidnapping, as I said, was how slavery in the South got started, but as Exodus 21 says, he who kidnaps a man, whether he sells him or is found in his possession, he shall surely be put to death. Then there are the anti-return laws. Unlike the antebellum South, Israel was to offer safe harbor to runaway foreign slaves in Deuteronomy 23. Again, a marked contrast with the United States fugitive slave law. Indeed, in the ancient Near East, the Code of Hammurabi in Babylon demanded that the death penalty would be given to those who helped runaway slaves, who harbored them as fugitives. The Old Testament scholar Christopher Wright observes, no other ancient Near Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, and the otherwise universal law regarding runaway slaves was that they must be sent back with severe penalties for those who failed to comply. Runaway slaves even had greater latitude in Israel because they could settle in any of the cities which they chose to live in Israel. The Israelites themselves had to live within their own tribal territories. But runaway foreign slaves could settle in whatever cities they could manage to find a place. If these three clear laws from Exodus and Deuteronomy had been followed in the South, slavery would have been a non-issue.
Copan claims that if the South had implemented 3 items from the law of Moses, there wouldn't have been an issue. First, he points to Israel's anti-harm laws. I will address this point in detail later, but let me say that these anti-harm laws are not as good as Copan is suggesting. Although there were some things that couldn't be done to Hebrew slaves, the same restrictions didn't apply to non-Hebrew slaves. Second, Copan points to Israel's anti-kidnapping laws. He states that the slavery was started in the West when people were taken against their will from other countries. However, let's look at these anti-kidnapping laws to see if they are actually better than what occurred in the United States. Notice that Deuteronomy 24:7 says that if a man is found stealing one of his brothers of the people of Israel, he must die. However, this says absolutely nothing about kidnapping foreigners and treating them as slaves. Copan ignores this fact and tries to apply this law everywhere, even though the text does not state such. Israel's law here was no better than the United States, as you were not allowed to enslave a U.S. citizen. Third, Copan points to Israel's anti-return laws. He states that the Hebrews were to offer safe harbor to runaway foreign slaves. This is definitely true as found in Deuteronomy 23. However, why were they to provide safe harbor? Is it because they were opposed to slavery? As we will see later, the answer to this is no. Instead, Israel had several enemies. So not returning a slave was a way that Israel could stick it to their enemies. Now let's contrast this to what occurred in the antebellum South. Here we have people from the North who would harbor slaves. However, it was solely because they were against slavery. And as we shall see later, Israel didn't have a problem with slavery.
Now I want to examine a few of the difficult texts. There's one that is mentioned, Exodus 21, verses 20 and 21. Let me just read that briefly. It says, if a man strikes his male servant or his female servant with a staff so that he or she dies as a result of the blow, he will surely be punished. However, if the injured servant survives 1 or 2 days, the owner, the master, the employer, will not be punished, for he has suffered the loss. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, boy, that's kind of harsh. Well, a lot of times they don't read what precedes it, and this is in the context of accidental deaths or injury. And in the case of accidental death or injury, what you have is, in the previous case, you have the person who has been responsible for harming someone actually showing care by paying the medical expenses for the person who is injured. And so in this text, we have kind of a continuation of that theme. And so when you read that this person had suffered the loss, it's probably the same sort of thing that this person is trying to show, the employer is trying to show that he was not intending to take anyone's life, and so is actually paying the medical bills to show that the intention was not to kill or to maim or anything like that. And so that would be taken under consideration by the judge. But it's interesting that if the employer strikes his employee so that he dies immediately, and again, this is stunning in the ancient Near East, then that person who took his life was to be put to death. That is what the word nakam in the Hebrew is. He will surely be punished. And again, this is always used of a death penalty scenario. So there is not this permission to simply beat slaves and within an inch of their life and say, oh, he survived, he's okay. Nothing like that. There's actually a lot more to be discussed in that. And I can't get into a lot more detail because I am, like the Egyptian mummy, pressed for time here.
First of all, it's important to note that Exodus 21:20 and 21 applies only to Hebrew slaves. This is made clear in Exodus 21:2, which refers to buying a Hebrew slave. Copan quotes these verses from the New English Translation. Why? It appears that the point he wants to focus on is the phrase, suffered the loss. Now, the New American Standard Bible uses the phrase, for he is his property, and the English Standard Version uses the phrase, for the slave is his money. The NIV says, since the slave is their property. Even the King James Version says, for he is his property. It appears that Copan has selected a translation that fits most with the argument he is trying to make. He wants the listener to interpret the phrase, suffered the loss, as an implication that the owner was going to have to pay medical bills. In this way, he hopes that the slave will appear to be more human to the owner than chattel. But even if we go with Copan's interpretation, what does it really buy him in the end? Does he not think that the owner of an ox might pay for medical treatment should the animal need it? While the animal was laid up, wouldn't this have a negative effect on the owner's profit? Likewise, wouldn't we expect a slave owner in the South to pay for medical care when their slaves were injured, even when they were beaten by the owner? The owner purchased the slave to work. While the slave couldn't work, the owner lost money. Next, Copan says that the owner whose slave died immediately upon being beaten would be put to death. The Hebrew word used here is nakam, which means to avenge. Copan claims it is always used in a death penalty scenario. However, this just isn't true. In fact, I'm not even sure it's ever used this way. Instead, look at the other verses in the same chapter that describe the death penalty. Each of these verses contain the phrase muth muth, which means be put to death. Now, nakam does have a strong meaning, and in many cases it does imply death. However, I'm not sure we have enough information to know that in this particular context it means death penalty. It could very well mean that. However, it could also mean repayment of some other sort for the offense, such as money. With all this talk, it appears that Copan wants to distract us from the main issue, which is this: the owner is allowed to beat his slaves. The only restrictions on this cruelty was that the slave couldn't die immediately and that his eyes and teeth could not be damaged. The slave could even die a day or two after this beating, and there would be no punishment. How is this moral? And to make things worse, as we'll discuss later, non-Hebrew slaves weren't even afforded these restrictions. The law indicated that they could be treated more ruthless.